Censors thought they could control what people saw, but Grindhouse Cinema had other plans. These films didn't just cross the line, they danced on it, laughed at it, and sold tickets because of it. From gore-splattered experiments to revenge-fueled nightmares, Grindhouse was built on controversy. So here's the question. When Hollywood played safe, who had the guts to flip off the rulebook? Stick around, some of these movies went even further than you'd imagine. I Spit on Your Grave, 1978. If there's one title that defined Grindhouse rebellion, it's this one. Released in 1978, Miyazarchi's low-budget revenge tale didn't just make critics angry, it made them furious. It was pulled from theaters, banned in several countries, and called one of the most vile movies ever made. And yet, fans lined up at Grindhouse theaters across America to see what the fuss was about. The film followed a young woman isolated in the countryside, subjected to unimaginable cruelty, who later turns the tables on her attackers. The story itself wasn't new, but Zarchi filmed it with an unflinching camera. Where mainstream Hollywood cut away from violence, this movie stared straight into it. That raw, no-frills approach made audiences squirm, but it also made them talk. Critics trashed it, calling it worthless. But underground audiences saw something different, a story that refused to let the villains win. Over time, it became a cult symbol of Grindhouse's sheer defiance. You couldn't ignore it, and Zarchi clearly never wanted you to. Whether people hated it or praised it, the movie lived up to Grindhouse's golden rule: make them remember you. This wasn't art in the traditional sense, but Grindhouse never pretended to be. It was provocation, pure and simple. And I Spit on Your Grave proved you didn't need big stars or studio money to shock the system. Cannibal Holocaust, 1980. Even among Grindhouse fans, this one carried an almost forbidden reputation. Technically an Italian production, it exploded in the American Grindhouse circuit in the early 80s, and censors wanted it gone immediately. The reason? Its violence was so convincing that the director, Ruggero Deodato, was arrested in Italy and had to prove his cast was still alive. That's how real it looked. The movie followed a group of documentary filmmakers who head into the Amazon jungle, only for their footage to reveal unspeakable brutality. It was presented in a found footage style years before the Blair Witch Project popularized it. The effect was raw, disturbing, and unlike anything audiences had seen before. American grindhouses embraced it because it delivered exactly what their crowds wanted, something dangerous, something that felt like it wasn't supposed to exist. The more governments banned it, the more audiences wanted it. Its legacy grew out of outrage, not praise. Critics called it sadistic. Censors slammed it as unacceptable. But the Yes-He movie became a cornerstone of Grindhouse lore, daring viewers to test their own limits. It blurred the line between documentary and fiction so convincingly that even now, people debate whether it went too far. For Grindhouse, though, too far was exactly the point, and Cannibal Holocaust made sure no one ever forgot it. Faster, Pussycat. Kill. Kill. 1965. Russ Meyer was no stranger to controversy, but this was his crown jewel of Grindhouse defiance. Released in 1965, Faster, Pussycat, Kill, Kill, told the story of three thrill-seeking women tearing across the desert in muscle cars, leaving a trail of chaos and destruction. At a time when Hollywood was still painting women as gentle side characters, Meyer cranked the dial in the opposite direction. These women weren't here to smile pretty. They were aggressive, commanding, and ready to beat down anyone who got in their way. It was stylish, violent, and laced with energy that mainstream critics didn't know how to handle. The Los Angeles Times called it pure trash. But that didn't matter. At grindhouses, audiences cheered. The movie combined the speed of drag racing with the danger of pulp crime. Its camera angles, snappy editing, and explosive dialogue made it feel alive in a way most polished studio films weren't. And over time, what critics dismissed as disposable became a cult icon, inspiring everything from Quentin Tarantino's Kill Bill to pop culture's obsession with anti-heroes. Meyer gave Grindhouse exactly what it thrived on: spectacle and rebellion. Faster, Pussycat wasn't just ahead of its time, it was a middle finger to an industry that thought it knew what audiences wanted. Turns out, audiences wanted exactly this. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, 1974. Before this movie, horror was scary. After it, horror was a nightmare you couldn't shake. Tobe Hooper's The Texas Chainsaw Massacre hit theaters in 1974 and instantly became one of the most controversial films ever screened. Censors across the world tried cutting it, banning it, or watering it down. None of it worked. Grindhouses showed it uncut, and the legend was born. Shot on a shoestring budget in sweltering Texas heat, the film's gritty realism made it feel more like a snuff tape than a traditional horror flick. Leatherface and his family weren't polished monsters. They were sweaty, deranged, and disturbingly believable. The low-quality film stock, the shaky handheld shots, all of it added to the terrifying illusion that you were watching something real. Audiences fainted. Some ran out of theaters. Yet the movie made millions, proving controversy sold tickets. Hollywood couldn't replicate that kind of raw power. What critics labeled as tasteless, fans embraced as groundbreaking. It also rewrote the rulebook on horror villains. Instead of charming vampires or clever mad scientists, we got a man in a mask made of human skin, charging at victims with a chainsaw. Pure chaos. Pure Grindhouse. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre wasn't just a movie. It was a dare. And anyone brave enough to take it never forgot what they saw. Elsa, she-wolf of the SS, 1975. Grindhouse thrived on taboo, and few movies dared to push buttons like this one. Released in 1975, Elsa, she-wolf of the SS, was set in a prisoner camp and centered on a brutal commandant who believed pain could break anyone's spirit. The film was so shocking that even its advertising campaign leaned into the controversy, warning audiences they were about to witness something beyond belief. What made it explode in grindhouses was simple. No studio would touch it. Independent producers knew mainstream theaters wouldn't go near it, so they sent it straight to the grindhouse circuit where shock was the currency. Crowds were appalled, but they were also curious. Word spread fast, and the film became notorious. Censors loathed it, critics tore it apart. But like so many grindhouse staples, it made its mark because it didn't care about approval. It went where others refused to go, and that's exactly why it became unforgettable. The film also cemented a new kind of cult anti-hero in cinema, one that terrified as much as it fascinated. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't polished, and it definitely wasn't safe. But that's Grindhouse at its core. If a movie could make you look over your shoulder walking out of the theater, it had done its job. Elsa did exactly that. The Last House on the Left, 1972. Wes Craven's debut wasn't just a horror movie, it was a gauntlet thrown at the censors. The Last House on the Left dropped in 1972 with the tagline, "To avoid fainting, keep repeating, it's only a movie. Only a movie." That line wasn't marketing fluff. It was a warning. What Craven and producer Sean Cunningham created was so raw and unsettling that even Grindhouse regulars were shaken. The story followed two teenage girls who fall into the hands of escaped convicts, leading to a harrowing sequence of brutality. But the real shock came later when the parents of one victim decide to take revenge. Unlike the polished thrillers of the time, this film looked and felt almost documentary-like. The camera lingered where others would cut away, creating an atmosphere that felt uncomfortably real. Critics called it degrading, and several theaters refused to play it. Yet at grindhouses, audiences lined up. Why? Because this wasn't a safe scare. It was ugly, chaotic, and unpredictable. Exactly what grindhouse crowds craved. It also marked the arrival of Wes Craven as a fearless filmmaker who didn't care about rules. The movie was chopped and censored across the globe, but the damage, or brilliance, depending on who you ask, was already done. The Last House on the Left didn't just bend the limits of acceptability, it blew them apart, setting a new standard for horror's capacity to disturb. Blood Feast, 1960. 3. Before Grindhouse theaters were overflowing with gore, one man cracked the door wide open: Herschel Gordon Lewis. His 1963 shocker Blood Feast is often called the first true splatter movie. While mainstream horror relied on suspense and shadows, Lewis went for the jugular, literally. The plot was simple. A deranged caterer kills his victims as part of a ritual, using their body parts to cook a feast. Sounds absurd. It was. But Lewis leaned into the absurdity, piling on bright red fake blood, exaggerated wounds, and effects that made audiences gag. By today's standards, the effects look dated. Back then, they were revolutionary. Censors didn't know what to do with it. There was no precedent. The gore wasn't implied. It was right there on the screen. Critics slammed it as trash. Drive-in theaters and grindhouses saw dollar signs. The more outraged parents and politicians got, the more curious audiences became. Blood Feast's legacy isn't in its story, but in its impact. It proved you could sell a movie almost entirely on shock value. Lewis himself became known as the godfather of gore, paving the way for decades of splatter films that followed. At the time, it was dismissed as junk. Today, it's recognized as the spark that lit the Grindhouse fire. Without Blood Feast, the genre might never have had the guts to shove it in the censors' faces so boldly. Switchblade Sisters, 1975. What happens when you combine girl gangs, betrayal, and over-the-top Grindhouse style? You get Switchblade Sisters, a 1975 cult gem directed by Jack Hill. Originally titled The Jezebels, this movie delivered exactly what the Grindhouse audience wanted: rebellion, violence, and wild characters who didn't play by anyone's rules. The story centered on a teenage gang of girls who clash with rivals, fight for control, and leave a trail of destruction in their wake. At the time, most Hollywood depictions of young women leaned toward sweet, safe, and stereotypical. Jack Hill flipped that script completely. These girls weren't passive. They carried knives, shotguns, and threw themselves into chaos head first. Critics dismissed it as trashy exploitation. But Grindhouse fans loved it for the same reason critics hated it. It was unapologetic. The acting was over the top, the dialogue sharp and campy, and the energy relentless. You didn't watch Switchblade Sisters for polish. You watched it for raw power. Like many Grindhouse movies, it didn't make a splash in mainstream theaters, but its cult following grew. Quentin Tarantino later helped revive it in the 90s, calling it a forgotten classic. That endorsement sealed its place in Grindhouse history. Switchblade Sisters told censors exactly what Grindhouse was all about: stories too wild, too gritty, and too loud to ever fit into the Hollywood box. And that's why it still stands tall today. The Beyond, 1981. Lucio Fulci wasn't American, but his work became a Grindhouse staple across the U.S., and none more so than The Beyond. Released in 1981, this Italian nightmare film about a cursed hotel built over one of the 7 gates of hell tested even the most hardened viewers. Fulci didn't play by the usual rules of narrative. Instead, he flooded the screen with surreal imagery, haunting sound design, and gore effects that pushed censors to the breaking point. Victims had their faces melted by acid, eyes gouged, and worse. It was relentless. Mainstream theaters shied away, but grindhouses embraced it. Censors hacked it to pieces for international releases, trimming out the most shocking scenes. But in American grindhouses, fans hunted down uncut prints, and those underground screenings gave it a second life. The more authorities tried to suppress it, the bigger its legend grew. The Beyond wasn't just about blood and guts. It was about atmosphere. Fulci created a waking nightmare where logic didn't matter, only dread. Critics scoffed, but Grindhouse fans saw it for what it was: an experience. You didn't just watch The Beyond. You survived it. Today, it's recognized as one of Fulci's masterpieces and one of the defining Grindhouse imports. For audiences back then, it was proof that horror didn't need to make sense to terrify. Sometimes, it just needed to leave scars on your memory. Vice Squad, 1982. By the early 80s, Grindhouse was fading, but films like Vice Squad proved the spirit was still alive. Directed by Gary Sherman, this 1982 crime thriller followed a single night in Los Angeles as a street worker and a relentless cop hunt down one of the most sadistic villains of the era, a pimp nicknamed Ramrod. Ramrod wasn't a charming bad guy. He was pure menace, and actor Wings Hauser played him with such intensity that he became one of the most terrifying Grindhouse villains ever. His scenes were so disturbing that even jaded audiences gasped. The movie didn't shy away from showing the grit of nighttime Los Angeles. It was sweaty, dangerous, and filled with characters on the edge. Critics were appalled, but Grindhouse fans loved its unflinching look at the darker corners of the city. It wasn't pretty, but it was unforgettable. What really cemented Vice Squad's place in Grindhouse history was Hauser's performance. He improvised lines, screamed with manic energy, and turned what could have been a forgettable role into something iconic. His portrayal of Ramrod was so intense that it carried the whole movie into cult status. Vice Squad didn't make waves in mainstream theaters, but in grindhouses, it became an instant classic. It was a reminder that even as the Grindhouse era was ending, its power to disturb, provoke, and stick in your brain was still alive and well. Pink Flamingos, 1972. If Grindhouse cinema had a crown jewel of outrageous defiance, John Waters' Pink Flamingos wears it proudly. Released in 1972, this underground oddity wasn't designed. For mainstream audiences, it was crafted to shock, disgust, and leave jaws hanging. And it succeeded. Waters himself called it an exercise in bad taste, but for Grindhouse theaters, it was gold. The movie followed a bizarre competition to determine the filthiest person alive. That setup alone promised absurdity, but Waters delivered something so outlandish that critics either walked out or wrote furious columns condemning it. Mainstream reviewers called it trash of the lowest order. Grindhouse fans, they couldn't get enough. Pink Flamingos wasn't about polish or production value. It was about rebellion. It gave audiences permission to laugh at what society deemed untouchable. Every outrageous gag and grotesque stunt doubled as a middle finger to censors who thought they could police cinema. And the more it was condemned, the more people flocked to see it. Over time, the film became a midnight movie staple, passed around like contraband. John Waters cemented himself as a filmmaker who thrived on shock and satire, and Pink Flamingos proved that Grindhouse cinema didn't need Hollywood's approval to change the culture. It only needed audiences who loved chaos. This film didn't just push boundaries, it bulldozed them. And it remains one of the clearest examples of Grindhouse's ability to turn outrage into legend. Death Race 2019, 75. Roger Corman was the king of cheap thrills, and Death Race 2000 might be his most perfect Grindhouse creation. Released in 1975, this satirical action flick imagined a future where drivers competed in a cross-country road race, earning points not just for speed, but for mowing down pedestrians. Yes, really. Mainstream critics recoiled at its gleeful violence. Politicians labeled it irresponsible. But for Grindhouse audiences, it was a masterpiece of excess. The blend of cartoonish action, campy dialogue, and outrageous social commentary made it unforgettable. With David Carradine leading the cast and a young Sylvester Stallone stealing scenes, the film managed to be both ridiculous and brilliant at the same time. The special effects were cheap, the stunts often over the top, and the costumes outlandish. But that was exactly the charm. It played like a comic book gone berserk, and it knew exactly what it was doing. Where Hollywood tried to play safe with sanitized science fiction, Corman cranked out a wild dystopian thrill ride that doubled as a sly jab at American culture's obsession with violence. Death Race 2000 wasn't just a Grindhouse hit. It became a cult classic that influenced video games, comic books, and even later Hollywood films. Grindhouse may not have invented satire, but it sure knew how to sell it with explosions and mayhem. When Censors groaned, Corman just smiled, because controversy always meant more tickets sold. A Clockwork Orange, 1971. Yes, it's British. Yes, it was directed by Stanley Kubrick. But in America, this film found its true cult home in grindhouses. Released in 1971, A Clockwork Orange told the story of Alex, a charismatic delinquent in a near-future Britain, and his journey through violence, punishment, and control. On paper, it was high art. On screen, it was pure provocation. Mainstream theaters struggled to contain the uproar. Religious groups condemned it, politicians called it dangerous, and critics accused it of glamorizing violence. In the UK, Kubrick himself pulled it from circulation after reports of copycat crimes. But in America, grindhouses embraced it, projecting uncut prints to audiences who couldn't believe what they were watching. The movie's mix of futuristic style, classical music, and shocking brutality created a sensory overload that was unlike anything audiences had ever seen. It wasn't just shocking, it was stylishly shocking, which only made censors angrier. They couldn't dismiss it as trash. It was an award-winning director telling them to shove it. Grindhouse crowds ate it up. They didn't care about the debates in the New York Times. They cared that the movie pushed every boundary possible and dared viewers to wrestle with what they were seeing. For the Grindhouse circuit, A Clockwork Orange wasn't just a movie. It was a cultural event, proof that even prestige filmmakers could join the rebellion. Kubrick didn't play by the rules, and that's why his film became one of the most notorious Grindhouse staples of all time. So there you have it, 13 Grindhouse classics that didn't just break the rules. They shredded them. Censors could ban, cut, and complain all they wanted, but Grindhouse audiences always found a way to see the unfiltered version. Which of these movies do you think pushed the boundaries the hardest? Drop your thoughts in the comments, hit subscribe if you love cinema that bites back, and remember, the dirtier the fight with the censors, the bigger the legend.